Hello and welcome to my review of the Hanwei Rhinelander Bastard Sword. This was probably the second or third medieval sword I purchased, and I was looking for something that was extremely versatile, something that I could learn a little bit more about cutting and thrusting, something that I wouldn't be worried about damaging, something that was well made but inexpensive, and this sword really fit the bill for me. But what is a bastard sword? Well, a bastard sword is a long sword. It has a grip and weighting, which allows you to use it with one or two hands. It has a long blade. It can be used mounted. It can be used on foot. And this sword really fits that bill, has all those features. The sword is advertised as typical of the late 15th century Central European cut and thrust swords, and I think it really does, for the most part, fit that historical billing quite accurately. The 15th century saw plate armor really reach its peak, where those who could afford it could outfit themselves from head to toe and be extremely well protected from many of the weapons of the day. However, the average soldier could not afford that type of protection and would basically find himself wearing a helm and perhaps a brigandine that was made of cloth or leather and reinforced with either mail or with iron plates. But quite frequently it didn't have any of that additional augmentation. A versatile weapon that could thrust through the gaps in plate armor, because cutting through that plate was not very effective, and would not really be the type of weapon you would be looking to use against that type of opponent, as well as something that could be effective against that average soldier where you could effectively cut through the type of protection he had, or especially through his unprotected parts, was really required. The Oakshot Type 18 and its subtype blades was just such a compromise weapon that could both cut and thrust, and according to Oakshot, the most widely used sword between 1410 and 1510 all over Europe, so for the entire 15th century. In this case, it's an Oakshot Type 18A blade, and those types of blades were used in the 15th century. They were broad at the base and then tapered to a very fine point, as this one does. They had a fuller that was about a third to about a half the length of the blade, and as you can see, this sword has a fuller which runs about 2/3 the length of the blade. While the Oakshot specs and classifications are not necessarily 100% for everything, you do find variety. This one obviously is a little bit outside that fuller length spec. It was then a flattened diamond shape down to the end of the blade. It had a hand and a half type grip, and there were many different types of guards and pommels used on those Type 18A blades. Well, the Rhinelander Bastard Sword is a really good example of that type of blade. The sword overall is 45 inches long. It's made of 5160 carbon steel and weighs just over 3 pounds. The blade itself is 36 inches long. As I said, it has a fuller that runs 2/3 the length of the blade. It is a flattened diamond. After the fuller, right down, has a very acute point. The point of balance is just about 5 inches, and that is very effective for helping the sword be used with one or two hands, with the weighting that is present in the hilt and especially the pommel. It has a brushed finish, which is quite different than many of the swords you see. Here's an example of a pretty typical sword, and as you can see, it has a very highly polished shine. Most swords you're able to find do have that. This one's a bit different. I think it well suits the sword, however. Hanwei swords are hand-forged and ground in China. The hilt and fittings are quite well done. The guard is an Oakshot style 11 guard. It's rounded with these little knots at the end, slight taper down to provide some additional protection. It does have a nice ring guard as well, which is round with some decorative pieces in the center. The cutout for the sword is extremely well done and tight-fitting for a sword of this price point. The grip itself is made of wood and covered in leather. The leather is just glued, but the seam is very well done, and you can barely feel it when you're holding the sword. The pommel itself is a Oakshott Type 5 pommel, a scent stopper pommel. It has really good weight and heft to it and provides much of that balance you need for using the sword with one or two hands. The sword is advertised as having a riveted tang. I think that's a bit of a language difference. It's actually peened over the pommel. This is the one part of the sword which hasn't been extremely well done. It is, as you can see, quite a rough job. They could have done a little bit better job of smoothing and rounding that out at the base of that peen. Overall, though, I think the fit and finish of this sword and the workmanship is quite good, especially when you consider the price point of this sword. Extremely well balanced and very effective with one or two hands. For those of you familiar with the Witcher series of books and games, there are actually a number of swords in the Witcher series and game that look exactly like this sword. So not only is it quite a historically accurate sword for a 15th century Oakshott Type 18 sword, it's also really good fantasy sword and fits really well into the Witcher universe. The sword performs really well in flex tests, returning to true with no problem. And it's extremely flexible in cutting and thrusting with one or two hands. As I said, I got this sword pretty early in my medieval sword collection. It's been used by a lot of different people. No destructive testing, bottles and fruit mainly. Although the aim of some of the people was not great, the sword has encountered my wood stand a few times, but it has come out of it unblemished and worked quite well and quite effectively in doing those tests. The sword comes with a leather scabbard, metal end and top. The leather is okay, not the highest quality, but quite well done. Inside of the scabbard is definitely not wood. I can't tell exactly what it is looking inside, but it's not wood. But the sword fits very snugly in the scabbard, doesn't shake around and definitely won't fall out. Overall, I think the Hanwei Rhinelander Bastard Sword is quite a good sword and quite a good example, historical example of an Oakshott Type 18A blade. The only one exception I would say is perhaps the fuller is a little long for that classification of sword. It has a good example of an Oakshott Type 11 guard and a Type T5 scent stopper pommel. The blade also fits into the fantasy universe, the Witcher universe, quite well and is a good representation of a sword from those books. It's an extremely flexible sword, can be used quite easily with one hand, and is very effective with two hands. It's a great thruster, it's a good chopper. I think this would be a pretty good addition to your collection if you're looking for an extremely well-priced sword with pretty high quality workmanship and tremendous versatility in how it can be used. Thank you very much.